Hello. Today we're not going to do all of that much. We're just going to go over the quiz question answers from your open note quiz that you had on Friday and that was due last night. Um, Besides that, what you should be doing, I posted it yesterday, but it was the evidence for evolution, and I posted a new free response question. So that's still going to be your assignment. I'm not assigning anything new today. That's it. Today we're just going over the quiz questions. Okay, so evolutionarily, number one, evolutionarily, what is the goal of every organism? Okay, and this is a big misconception. This can lead to misconceptions. The biggest goal of every organism is to reproduce. Okay, and to survive, as a proxy of that, you will need to survive to reproduction. Okay, so in order to reproduce, you obviously have to survive to reproduction. So that's the goal. That's it. That increases that organism's evolutionary fitness is by reproducing. So what some of you guys put was to become fit to their environment. Okay, that's a fundamental misconception in that that's their goal, but that's not the goal of the organism. The organism just wants to survive and reproduce, and that's it. Populations adapt over time to the environment. Okay, so you won't have just one organism that can just choose to change its traits and adapt. That's not how it works. They either have the traits that are adapted or they don't. They either survive and reproduce or they don't. That's it. They have those traits or they don't. Okay, so populations evolve and adapt to their environment. Individuals survive and reproduce. But I understand that the term fitness can be confusing sometimes because because we think of fitness as something that we can currently adapt and make better. And there's also that term adapt that can be used in different ways. So first of all, fitness. In terms of evolution, evolutionary fitness just means to reproduce more, and that's it. So I would have a greater evolutionary fitness if I had a bunch of kids and grandkids, and that's it. All right? So we're not talking about fitness in any other way other than that. Adapting or adaptation to an environment is something that happens over long periods of time. But it can be confused to, I can adapt to my own situations. This is how we use it in normal day-to-day life. We say, I can adapt. This is a new challenging and changing world we're in, but I can adapt. Okay, that's different than how we use it in evolutionary biology. In evolutionary biology, I can adapt, as in change my mindset, but I cannot, or adapt or change my mindset, or I don't know, change my behaviors. I can do that, yes. But I cannot change my traits to be more fit to the environment. Okay? I can't change my skin color. Okay, well, I can, but that would be fake. I'd just be fake bacon. And I'd still have a limit of how tan I could get. All right, so I cannot make myself super, super, super dark. I am very white. I am not going to get that dark. Okay, I'm limited by my genetics. I'm limited by my traits. I cannot adapt to my environment by making myself the most attractive supermodel of all time. I cannot do that without surgery. I can't do that because I'm limited by my traits. Okay, so think of adaptation and adapting as a population-wide adaptation to the environment over time. And try to think of wild natural populations as opposed to humans, because it can get tricky understanding these concepts with humans, because we created some interesting, with technology, it's kind of not really fair. Okay, so number 2. If a DNA sequence of Ebola virus that was isolated from a patient has accumulated a large number of mutations, does that mean it was likely isolated from earlier in the outbreak or later? We talked about last week that later in the outbreak, you'd have more mutations because that virus has more time to adapt. Those populations of viruses have time to adapt. And those mutations that give them an advantage will be passed on to those next generations. So a virus that started 5 years ago and then has been through has reproduced, that same species and strain of virus likely has a lot more mutations 5 years down the line because it's accumulated some good mutations over time. So more mutations means later in the outbreak when you're looking at a reference sequence anyway. All right, if a mutation was advantageous to the virus in that it allowed the virus to spread faster, what would you notice happening over time to the sequences of virus you collected in the population? Well, on those same lines that we just talked about, all or most of the viruses would include that same mutation because it gave a reproductive advantage. So just like natural selection with the rock pocket mouse, for example, we got the light color, the dark color of fur, and those over time you saw in the darker environments, the mice with the darker fur, there were more mice with darker fur. Same thing for a virus passing through cells and causing outbreaks. If you collected, over time, you collect a virus in an outbreak like COVID-19, if you collected a virus now, one of those COVID-19s, it probably has mutations that give it a reproductive advantage. As opposed to back in November when it started, it's probably accumulated some mutations that gave it more spreadability or transmissibility. And it's surviving longer on surfaces, for example. It's likely accumulated some mutations that have given it a reproductive advantage. All right, which of these conditions are always true of populations evolving due to natural selection? Condition 1, the populations must vary in the traits that are heritable. Condition 2, some traits must increase reproductive success. Condition 3, individuals pass on most traits they acquire during their lifetime. Okay, so condition 1, yes, those traits must be heritable. They must have a genetic background or they're not going to be passed down to offspring if they don't have a genetic basis. Condition 2, yeah, you have to have heritable traits increasing reproductive success. Condition 3, if I were to change my hair or amputate my arm, I'm not going to give that to my children. There's no genetic basis in that. Condition 3, individuals pass on most traits that they acquire during their lifetime. That's not true because I dyed my hair during my lifetime. I've acquired that trait. Well, I didn't in real life, but I could. I'm not going to pass down that dyed hair color to my offspring. Okay, so the answer for this one would be condition 1 and 2. This would be the answer. A population of organisms will not evolve if all variation is due only to environmental, non-genetic factors. That is the answer. Okay, so a population can still definitely evolves even if the environment is changing at a slow rate. You still have evolution. Okay. The population size is large. Population size does not make a difference to how it evolves. Small populations can evolve and change allele frequencies faster, but that doesn't mean large populations are not evolving. The population lives in a habitat without a predator present. That's not the only way you evolve to a situation. You don't have to have a predator being the selective pressure. It could be a lot of different things in the environment that cause it to organisms to adapt. So it's not always a predator-prey relationship, although that can lead to evolution. It's not always about that. It could be competition between two different species of finch, for example. That's what Darwin studied. So he had finches that ate big seeds, finches that ate small seeds. And they adapted to basically, those species of finch, they originally started out as very similar species that ate the same thing, but over time they evolved to compete less against each other and diversify which food they ate. So that's an example of they're not evolving. They didn't really have any predators, but they're still evolving in that population was still evolving. But they do not evolve if the variation is due to environmental factors. For example, if I had a bunch of, if we had an area where it was a bunch of light-skinned people, but some people stayed out in the sun for a long time, and some people stayed inside and worked for a long time. Well, people who are working out in the sun have gotten more of a tan than the people who worked inside. So the skin color they have then is due to just variation and due to environments that they're in. It's not due to genetic factors, okay? Because we know skin color has genetic factor, but in this case, they all started out the same skin color. It's just some work inside more and some work outside more. So that population will not evolve based on skin color if it's just due to that environmental factor and not the genetic factor. Okay, so that's something that you need to understand. So in order to evolve and pass on traits, those traits have to have a genetic background. They have to be caused by a gene, DNA, that can be passed down to the next generation. Given a population that contains genetic variation, what is the correct sequence of the following events under the influence of natural selection? Okay, so you start with a change has to occur first, some kind of change that makes it so there's a selective pressure of some kind in the environment. So you start out with number 2. Okay, so that automatically knocks out these two. You gotta have some kind of change. If you don't have a selective pressure, then it's not gonna change. Well-adapted individuals, then we have 1, 3, and 4 left. Well-adapted individuals leave more offspring. 3, genetic frequencies change. 4, poorly adapted individuals have decreased survivorship. Well, now we're only choosing between these two, and they have 4 next. Okay, so both of them, we have people who, not people, but organisms that are not adapted to the environment are dying. Okay, decreased survivorship means dying. Makes sense. And then you're left with 1 or 2. Well, to get to 2, you have to have 1 happen first. You have to have those well-adapted individuals leaving more offspring, which will, over time, change the allele frequency, or genetic frequencies right here, 3. So we have, this one would be the answer, 2, 4, 1, 3. Genetic variation must be present in a population before natural selection can act upon that population. You have to have variation or you're not going to have natural selection. These other answers are just bogus answers. Which of these Hardy-Weinberg requirements would be difficult to meet with a small population? Okay, so what this is asking is which one of these is directly related to a small population? Natural selection, we can still have natural selection in a small population. Gene flow, you can still have migration. So yes, you can still have gene flow, even if the population is small. Mutation, the mutation is random, okay? So it doesn't really matter what size population you have. Mutation is going to happen. It's just going to be random. No sexual selection, doesn't matter about the size of the population there. But this one right here, no genetic drift. Genetic drift happens because a population is small. So that's why this one would be wrong, is because genetic drift is caused by small population sizes. All right, almost done. So we have Rocky Mountain juniper and one-seeded juniper have overlapping ranges. Okay, so they have overlapping regions of their population. Pollen grains, which are the sperm cells from one species, are unable to germinate and make pollen tubes on female ovules. These juniper species are kept separate by, it's not temporal because it doesn't say anything about them reproducing at different times or seasons. Behavioral isolation has nothing to do with behavior. Remember, that one is like birds, for example. Their songs don't match, or their mating dances don't match, so they wouldn't end up mating. It has nothing to do with that. It is gametic isolation because the sperm of one species cannot germinate and make pollen tubules, basically cannot penetrate the ovary of the female tree. That's all that is saying. And it wouldn't be geographic because they overlap, their ranges overlap, so it's not geographic isolation. And then these four, temporal, behavior, gametic, and geographic, they were pre-zygotic barriers, and this is a pre-zygotic situation. Hybrid sterility and hybrid breakdown, those are post-zygotic barriers. This is when they are able to make a zygote, but it's a sterile zygote. And this one is they can have a zygote, but it's not a viable zygote. So the answer is gametic isolation. All right, now let's get to the last one here, which is our Hardy-Weinberg question. Okay, had to get my whiteboard to help explain this one for Hardy-Weinberg. Make this a little bit bigger. But you could probably tell that I wrote this because, students from Union, Missouri, SS. Thought you guys might appreciate that. But this one is, it's not really even much of a Hardy-Weinberg question. It's more of a, can you use chi-square question? I'll show you what I mean here. Trying to make myself bigger. It may not work. Okay. So you have this guy. Now, in the original population from the 1900s, it gave you these percentages: 30% homozygous dominant, 50% heterozygous, 20% homozygous dominant. And for current population, we're given 14 homozygous dominant, 25 heterozygous, and 11 homozygous recessive. So this adds up, for the current population, it adds up to 50 dolphins. So that would be your observed in the current population. So you'd be putting that in the observed column. In the expected column, you're putting my percentages that I had up here, because we know we have 50 total dolphins in the current population. So we have to just take these percentages and apply it to the number 50. So 30% of 50 would be 15, 50% of 50 would be 25, 20% of 50 would be 10. So I would put those in the expected column, because if these allele frequencies were not changing, I would expect these guys to have those numbers. So then you do the whole chi-square, observed minus expected, observed minus expected squared, and then observed minus expected squared over expected. And that would lead you to the chi-square, which equals the sum of all of these, which would be 2. Then you, knowing your degrees of freedom is 2, you would get out your chi-square table and you would find where 2 degrees of freedom, which is here. Okay, 2 degrees of freedom. So I know I'm going to be in that row. And going over on that row, finding where my value 2 lies between. And I can see it's between, so here's 1.386 and 2.77. So I know 2 is going to be between there. So I know I'm between 0.5 and 0.25. So my p-value would be something in between there, which likely would be around 0.38 or something like that. But it's not less than our critical value. If it was over on this side, be underneath our critical value. It is not lower than our critical value of 0.05. So by our chi-square table, it is not significant. We're in the not significant range here. So if you're not significant, that means that these variations, the observed and expected variations that we see, are due to chance and not due to the population evolving, okay? So going back to our question, the population is The answer would be the population is not evolving because they are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, okay? Because we're not under the p-value of 0.05, we cannot say that that population is out of Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We cannot say it's evolving. Because look, if you look at these numbers, the observed versus the expected, they're not that different, right? So there's just a little bit of variation, which is due to chance that's what our p-value says. It's not due to evolution happening in our population. Okay, so that means that they are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We cannot reject our null hypothesis. We are supporting the null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is that they are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Hardy-Weinberg is the null hypothesis. So we know they are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. And if they are in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, that means that they are not evolving. So that would be the answer. Okay, that was the quiz. Remember, you guys are going to work on your evidence for evolution, and for your response questions, we will go over them tomorrow. Okay, bye.